So good morning. I want to start today by saying a huge thank you to Joanne, Eleanor, Amanda, and Josh, and Celine for pulling together our service last week so that there was something for you at 10:30. It was a little bit of work to do it, but we managed it, and you know what? The quality was all right. Yeah. Thank you, Alan. Thank you. I'm Cameron Watts. I'm the minister of Fairlawn Avenue United Church, and welcome. I identify as he, him, and today's speaker comes to us through Claire. Claire is a local barista at my favorite local coffee shop. Claire also is a student, and in having a conversation with her one morning, I discovered that Claire is also a specialist in security and hate crime. She has studied this well enough that she now is unavailable as a barista because there's an election about to be called, and it's possible that a Canadian security agency has contracted her to keep track of some white supremacist groups and what they will do during the election. She anticipates beginning a PhD at London School of Economics, and this is my way of saying, you should always get to know your barista. So I spoke to her and asked her to come as part of Black History Month because she knows an awful lot about injustice, and I thought it would be a great thing to have her come and do that for us because we seek justice. And we who are favored by our place in life sometimes need to understand the roots of racism, which are deep within us all. Claire could not come because of that short-term contract. So she put me in touch with Dr. Barbara Perry of the Ontario Technical University. You can find out more about Barbara and the work that she has done with regard to hate crime. She has worked with LGBTQ groups. She has worked with Indigenous groups. She has worked with trans groups. In December, she received an Order of Canada for her work with people who are trying to deal with folks who like to exploit hate crimes. Today, and if you want more information, there's stuff about her in the bulletin. Today, she's going to talk to us about exploring the contemporary contours of hate. She gave a lot for us today, but she also pre-recorded her talk. She wanted to Zoom, but we couldn't figure out how to do that, so she pre-recorded it. She is celebrating her birthday today in Prince Edward County. And so I said, yes, we are happy to have you do that because today also is my grandson's birthday, and if I told him he had to come to church, I would be in trouble, so I'm not telling her she had to go to church. And I need to tell you there's a lot here from her. We have slides and transcripts in your bulletins about what she's going to say, so you can follow along if you want. You can listen to her. I'm pretty sure Joanne's got the sound Belinda got the sound nailed for today. We're smiling in the back there. And Celine's hiding, and she's going to run the PowerPoint. If you don't get all of it, you've got a couple of options. One is that this will be on YouTube right after the service or shortly after, and the other one is that we'll show it again in the library about 20 minutes after coffee. So if you want to go in and sit and have some time with that, that's great. Dr. Perry's agreed to answer any questions or queries you have by email. And if you've got some questions or things you want me to ask her, I will write them down. I'll do it again after the service in case you think of something later on. I'm going to make sure that we get lots of information today and that we get our questions answered. Which of us has not had to confront hatred? Which of us has not been victimized by it? If you have been hated, here in this place, you are loved. If you have hated, here in this place, you are loved. If you need help to love those who hate you, as in Jesus' words last week, here you are loved, and here you are supported. We acknowledge that our white privilege was and is at work against our neighbors, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the Huron, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga of the New Credit peoples. Our ancestors exercised their white privilege and displaced them. And today we seek to understand ourselves better so we might learn to be better neighbors. I invite you to hear our invitation to worship. Hope blooms in likely places. It blooms where we are nurtured by the living waters, the waters of your Spirit's baptism, the waters of a good creation, the waters of people who care for us when we thirst. Hope blooms in unlikely places. It blooms when human strength rises to care in the midst of tragedy. It blooms when unexpected people are gracious with us. It blooms in humor. It blooms in those who combat despair. Today, we would be like trees planted by the waters of hope. Our scripture is from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, verses 5 through 10. Thus says the Holy One of Israel, "Cursed are those who trust in mere mortals, and make mere flesh their strength, whose hearts turn away from the Holy One. They shall be like a shrub in the desert, and shall not see when relief comes. They shall live in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. Blessed are those who trust in the Holy One, whose trust is the Holy One. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when the heat comes, and its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought, it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit. The heart is devious above all else. It is perverse. Who can understand it? I, the Holy One, test the mind and search the heart, to give to all according to their ways, according to the fruit of their doings."
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, I be on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When my way grows drear, precious Lord, linger near, and my life is almost gone. Hear my cry, hear my call, hold my hand, lest I fall. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When the darkness appears and the night draws and the day is past and gone. At the river I stand, guide my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. At the river I stand, guide my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a lovely morning. I wish I could be there with you, but I am celebrating my birthday actually at our home in lovely Prince Edward County. So couldn't get away, and so good that I can join you in some way. I will include my email address at the very end, so that if you have any questions that arise, you can feel free to email me, reach out, and I'll clarify anything because I'll be probably moving fairly quickly today. But I really do appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts and observations on the contemporary contours of hate, and sort of looking at a continuum from hate speech to hate crime to right-wing extremism or hate groups, as they're sometimes referred to. And I'm a sociologist by training, so I always like to contextualize these conversations with some idea of what's the environment that is allowing these dramatic increases that we've been seeing over the past decade or so, not just in Canada, but globally as well. And of course, we have to start with what we call the Trump effect, 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. And we saw how in the run up to the first election in, gosh, what year was that now? I'm losing track. In 2020. Was that right? 2016. We saw how his narratives really demonized a whole array of communities and gave rise to, both in the US and in Canada, a burgeoning far right movement, but also dramatic increases in all forms of hate crime, hate speech, online, offline, as well. And we saw some of that again in the aftermath of his losing election, the stolen election, as he liked to call it, around the insurrection of January 6th. And again, this time, not so much targeting particular groups, but really highlighting the lack of democratic process, the fact that democracy was broken, that political institutions were broken in that country, and again that bubbled up to the Canadian context. And of course, now we're in the midst of Trump 3.0, and we've seen just in less than a month the damage that's being done in terms of civil rights, in terms of even political rights, in terms of safety and security for a whole array of communities, including immigrant communities, trans communities, queer communities as a whole. So really damaging impact there that again has influenced our own narratives here, political narratives as well as popular narratives that we'll talk about in just a moment. So, as I said, the U.S. insurrection obviously was sort of another more fuel added to the flame of anti-state activism, anti-authority activism, as well as far-right narratives in general. And that was sort of coincident with COVID. It was more sort of at the end of COVID and the lockdowns and the public health restrictions, which gave rise to, again, dramatic upswing in targeted violence towards Asian communities and towards Jewish communities as well, both of whom, for different reasons, were held to be responsible for the virus. It was some sort of plot orchestrated by one or the other, or in some cases, both of those communities. And so we saw that. We also saw, of course, the anti-state activism that really coalesced in the convoys, and how conspiracy theories often were the entry point into far-right activity. So people adopted some of these conspiracy theories about, a tyrannical government, and that rolled over into anti-immigrant sentiment or reactions against multiculturalism and globalism. What they see as sort of the flaws of contemporary society and contemporary politics as well. We also saw, again, coincident with COVID in many respects, considerable backlash violence to the assertion of rights by Black communities and Indigenous communities in particular, again, both in Canada and the US. So when both communities were speaking out against, violence at the hands of law enforcement or the hands of the state writ large. Indigenous protesters in Canada also protesting around the loss or threats to Indigenous rights and land and resources. So when these communities spoke up, when they protested, they were often subject to very negative reaction, narratives and language, but also in the forms of violence. So we saw dramatic increases in both anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violence in 1920, 21, and continuing to some extent as well. Oops, sorry, got away from me there. My mouse is too sensitive, apparently. Of course, in the last year and a half, we've seen a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim violence in the Canadian context in response to the Gaza war and the conflicts there. And I think that's an indication, as is the Trump effect, really, of the ways in which sort of geopolitical events outside of our boundaries, outside of our borders, also affect relationships between communities here and can contribute to conflict, domestic conflict, in response to international conflict as well. And in recent years, the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen considerable anti-trans activism and policies across the country. So I think probably most visible have been the protests at public schools, the attempts by anti-trans activists to infiltrate school boards so that they can impose their notion of what is acceptable in a curriculum on school boards. So, as I say, we've seen that at the school level, but we've also seen it at the provincial level, where trans rights and some queer rights generally have been walked back by a handful of provincial leaders. So all of this is to say that we've created an environment in which hate can flourish. We have normalized hate through often the narratives that we see coming from public figures who should be our role models, who should be sort of above the fray, if you will, and should be the defenders of democracy, the defenders of rights and the rule of law. And in fact, we've seen quite the opposite, obviously with Trump and the vilification of so many communities. Premier Legault of Quebec, this was on the eve of the anniversary, I think it was the third anniversary of the murders of 6 Muslim men in a mosque outside Quebec City, said, "I don't think there's Islamophobia in Quebec, so I don't see why there would be a day dedicated to Islamophobia." So this is a trivialization or a dismissal of the harm, not just associated with that particular event, but the daily harms that are experienced often by Muslims in that community. And then we see Derek Sloan, who was ousted from the caucus for this claim, claimed that banning conversion therapy would legalize child abuse. So, sort of falling prey to those age-old stereotypes and misinformation and disinformation about queer men in particular. And then Polyev most recently said, and again, coming back to that anti-trans activism, I'm not aware of any other genders than men and women. So, dismissing again the lived reality of people who are non-binary, who are trans. And that has trickled down, those kinds of attitudes and opinions have trickled down into public opinion polling. So we see here some examples. And I think these first three are very interesting because they suggest the extent to which the broader public has recognized that it's become more acceptable. People have become, as it suggests here, freer to express their prejudice and to express negative views of other communities. So, again, that environment of hate has trickled down. And I think these last two are particularly problematic. So, suggesting that there are too many visible minorities in Canada immigrating to Canada, and that immigration is a threat to white Canadians. So those are narratives taken right out of the playbook of far right actors. So very disturbing reflection of white supremacy as it's embedded in culture. And I think in general, it's important for us to recognize whether we're talking about hateful speech, whether we're talking about hateful actions, that there are significant harms associated with that. And of course, there's the harm to the initial victim, and we know now from almost 20 years, well, no, actually almost 30 years of scholarship on the harms of hate crime that they are often more injurious. That is, the violence often is more severe when perpetrated against someone because of their identity. And the emotional and psychological effects are often felt much more deeply by people who are attacked because of their identity and for longer periods of time as well. But it's also important to note that hate crimes are what we think of as message crimes. So this is what we're getting at here when we talk about harm to the victims group outside the neighborhood, and even harm to other targeted communities. So hate crimes are not just a message to the individual victim who's being targeted, but to the whole community. You're not welcome here. You're not valued here. Especially when we have things like, a swastika painted on a synagogue, or, we have, immigrants go home painted on an underpass, that sort of thing. They're very visible to all members of the community, and that's the intent, to draw everyone's attention to that sentiment. So often people who haven't necessarily been victimized themselves experience that same level of anxiety, that same fear, that same panic sometimes as initial, the immediate victims feel. They fear that they might be next, that they might also be targeted. And that goes for the victims community, but also sometimes similar communities. So if there is a particularly heinous act of anti-Muslim violence, or a campaign, a series of acts of violence against a Muslim community, other religious minorities might fear that they're next. So Sikhs or Hindus or even Jews might feel like they might be next. So the effects really are ripple effects in many ways. And then of course, hate crime and hate speech and hate groups obviously are damaging to societal norms and values. They're polarizing, as we're seeing right now. They're both, I think, cause and effect of the kind of polarization that we're seeing now. We have the narratives that create those divisions, create differences between people, create hatred, and then the acts of hate that might follow them further those divisions and tear communities apart even further. So there are multiple levels of harm that I think we need to be aware of. And even when we're talking about online hate, and I think online hate is, where most of us exposed to that because of the amount of time we spend, especially during COVID and even post COVID, where so many of us have remained in that space and live our lives in part in online spaces, especially youth, even more so than adults. And so, for example, one poll found that 80% of Canadian youth report seeing online hate. Might be directed to them, it might be directed to someone else, it might be sort of broader statements, hateful narratives directed towards a whole community, but there is dramatic exposure. And I think because of the number of forms and the number of spaces that hateful narratives take up. So we have direct attacks, that is email messages that are sent to individuals or even to groups that support targeted communities. So it might be, we've seen, I think in recent years, you've probably heard a lot about female politicians, for example, who are subject to just horrific, um, violent online speech and threats because they're seen to be acting outside of their accepted roles. They don't belong in the public sphere. They don't belong in politics. And so many women have unfortunately taken that message and have stepped down from politics or refused to engage in politics in the first place. So very anti-democratic in its impact. But there are also obviously indirect attacks as well. So, not sentiments that are directed towards an individual, but that characterize a whole group on web pages and online forums, on mainstream platforms like Facebook, and especially now Twitter or X as it's now known, which have fewer and fewer. Twitter, of course, having, or X now having very few filters, and Facebook even having fewer and fewer filters as well. So that these narratives of hate that vilify particular communities, the disinformation that holds communities responsible for all the ills of the world, are readily available to all of us, very widely disseminated. Even if we don't want to see them, they'll often cross some of the messages posts will cross our platforms. And there are dedicated websites, anti-Semitic websites or anti-gay websites or anti-woman or anti-feminist websites whose sole raison d'être is to attack the targeted communities, the enemy communities, if you will. And you see these in the mainstream, but more likely now to see them in fringe platforms that have been created specifically for that purpose. So things like Gab and Telegram, for example, where there is absolutely no content moderation, and that's the intention, is to allow for the free expression of and free speech, as they would describe it, free expression of all sorts of damaging and dangerous narratives as well. Now, granted, some of that is in encoded spaces that even as a researcher ethically I can't go to. But so we know that in the deep web or in some of these encrypted sites, there's even more problematic language in terms of actually strategizing against communities, strategizing against the government, for example. So very dangerous there. I think the one other thing I'll mention here is sort of this, the music, the video, the gaming spaces, and I mean, the music videos have long played an important role in far right narratives and far right action, both in terms of recruitment, bringing people in, but also then helping to forge a collective identity around that, what is often referred to as white power music. But increasingly, we're seeing the importance of gaming platforms. And it's not so much just the games themselves, although some of them are problematic enough. There's one that's been around since, oh gosh, when I was working in Arizona, so before 2000, called Ethnic Cleansing. And you can imagine from the title, it is what it says on the tin, where you get more points for killing people of color or for killing women or sometimes even police officers. So some of the games are bad enough. But what's really problematic now and have become important sites of recruitment are sort of some of the ancillaries or the supplements, like the chat rooms, where recruiters from a whole array of extremist orientations will lure people in. So they'll engage them, they'll befriend them in that online space and bring them into deeper and deeper spaces. It's not linear, it's not fast. Sometimes it is. I mean, sometimes it can happen in a matter of a few days, a few conversations, but typically it takes weeks, sometimes months to bring people in. But it's nonetheless a very effective means of doing that, giving people a sense of belonging, and there's someone who's listening to them. There's someone who cares about them, and then they introduce them to other websites or other games that reaffirms the negative narratives that they begin to weave for those individuals. So if we look next at hate crime, and you can see, I think, if you adopt those negative attitudes, if you adopt some of those really vilifying narratives, that there is an opportunity to escalate, if you will, into hate crime. You can see the dramatic increase that we've seen since 2016, since the Trump election, and we saw this pattern in the U.S. as well. A very similar increase there, bit of a decrease, but we're on a dramatic upward trend for the last 7 or 8 years in the Canadian context. So, we saw it was. I think we've been. This is from StatsCan, and they've been publishing these reports since I think about 2009, and it's been fairly steady over time. But now we see this. I think it's a tripling almost from 2016 to 2023. And some of that has to do with better police procedure, but there are very few police services that actually have expertise in hate crime. So I think that's not what accounts for this. I think it really does reflect. If we look at the data from civil society organizations like B'nai B'rith or like National Council of Canadian Muslims, we also see increases there. So this really is measuring something real that's happening in our communities. And where we're seeing those increases is in terms of race and ethnicity, and especially, during COVID, anti-Asian hate crime, but more typically increases in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous hate crime. And in terms of religion, increases in anti-Muslim and especially anti-Semitic hate crime over time. So you can see, how we've seen that dramatic increase reflected here. Also in sexual orientation, dramatic leap in 2023. Now, sort of going back, if we will, to this, I think if we'd seen this kind of increase in any other category of crime, I think we'd have been asking for, a public inquiry. What's happening here? That's not really what's happening. And in fact, I think it's interesting to note that at the same time we're seeing increases in hate crime, we're not seeing increases in non-bias motivated hate crime to that same extent. So if we look at general mischief, those motivated by hate crime, you can see the increase here, over 50% increase. And in terms of general mischief not motivated by hate crime, what's that? Probably about 5, maybe 8, 10%, something like that. Looking at common assault, hate crime increased about 50%. Hate-motivated common assaults increased by about 50%. Common assault decreased a little bit. So this is not part of a broader trend. This is something very specific to hate crime. Now, a lot of that is at the lower end, as we see here, in terms of mischief. So that's vandalism and graffiti, those sorts of things. Those very public crimes that I was referring to earlier on as message crimes. And so that means I think we shouldn't dismiss them because they are something that sends a message to the whole community. It does sort of inflict fear in targeted communities because there's a fear of escalation to uttering threats to assault, which also are relatively high cumulatively if we put them together. So I think, again, very important to pay attention to what seems like small potatoes, because that it can grow, it can escalate, and it affects so many people. Talk about that. So up one more step, looking at far right extremism. I know there's a lot here to unpack, and maybe I'll just talk about a couple. And again, happy to answer any questions if you want to send me an email for further clarification. So maybe we'll talk about accelerationists, because I think that's one of the movements that has become so evident in the past few years. So you might have heard about groups like the Base or Atomwaffen Division, or during COVID, Diagolon, an accelerationist group. And so these are activists who believe that the current order has become, political and social order has become so corrupt and has become so badly affected by multiculturalism, by immigration, by liberals, that it is prone to, its collapse is imminent, and so their aim is to, as the name suggests, accelerate that collapse, to accelerate through often political violence, a coming civil war, as they would see it, that will be a breakdown. So the insurrection of January 6th in the US was thought by some to be the beginning of that in the American context. And there were those who were coming across the country during the convoy saying that the convoy was our January 6th. It was beginning of our civil war as well. And the accelerationists have continue, and they try to provoke violence, provoke political violence, to sow chaos and uncertainty. Maybe the other one I'll talk about is gender defenders, because it's kind of an umbrella term for gender-based animosity. So whether that's misogyny or anti-feminism or homophobia or transphobia, these are adherents who understand again, with the accelerationists, that the current order is broken by virtue of recognizable and preferred gender roles and gender categories as well. So they're very fearful of the impact of the women's rights movement, for example, on men's rights, as if it's a zero-sum game, rather than expanding rights to all. And so this is where we see the incel movement that you might have heard about so much about, involuntarily celibate. So those who believe that the reason that they can't find a partner, that women reject them, is because of feminism, because women are too powerful and have rejected them. So again, a whole array, and it's become much more diversified, the far-right movement. When we did our first study in 2015, published in 2015, I think we were looking at then neo-Nazis, the lone actors, the skinheads, and white supremacists. And now we have a whole array of very distinct elements and ideologies reflected in the movement. And I'll come back to lone actors in just a moment. Right here. So this is, I think, one of the key reasons to be concerned about the rise of the right in the Canadian context. We now have 28 multiple murders associated with some variant from that graph earlier on, some variant of far-right ideologies. So we have 3 RCMP officers who were murdered in Moncton by anti-authority adherent, 6 Muslim men killed in Quebec City by someone who was Islamophobic and a great fan of Trump, and other far-right politicians across the globe. Of course, 2018, that was the Toronto van attack. 10 were killed immediately. The 11th succumbed to their injuries about a year and a half later. So I have included them in here. So this was an incel adherent. 2021, another Islamophobic murder, this time for family members, run down by a truck. And then 2022, this is maybe something that has flown under the radar, where 4 Indigenous women were killed by someone who was a member of a white supremacist group called Holy Europe. And so there we see the intersection of racism with misogyny as well, hatred of women, killing the 4 Indigenous women, maybe more, might be a serial killer, not quite sure yet. And so here we have 28. There are a couple of other individual murders, but these are, I think, especially significant because of the fact that it was a mass attack. And the other piece is that these 4, Moncton, Quebec City, Toronto, and London, were all those lone actors. I call them networked individuals. They acted on their own. They were not part of a conspiracy. There were not other people acting with them, but they were nonetheless very much a part of the online element, online community of the far right. They consumed hateful narratives online. Many of them actually produced similar narratives themselves. So they were part of that community, but acting on their own. So I think lone actors isn't quite the correct phrase. So that's why I like the idea of networked individuals. Some key trends that we're seeing with respect to the far right, obviously a growth in terms of numbers and groups. We're also seeing an atomization. That is, groups are still important, but we're seeing more and more individuals being drawn in, consuming those online narratives, those conspiracy theories, that disinformation, and weaving their own stories, their own ideologies together to make sense of what they see in the world around them, what they see in their own lives as well. So more and more of those networked individuals coming to the movement without necessarily affiliating with a particular group. We're also seeing a demographic shift, both in terms of older individuals and younger individuals. So if we look at the insurrection, if we look at Convoy, even the leaders of the Convoy who had deep roots in the far right movement, they are not just, disaffected youth, 18 to 24. These are middle-aged or older individuals being drawn into the movement. We're also seeing, and they tend to be, educated or well-employed, often self-employed, again, as we saw with the convoys. And we're also seeing at the other end of the spectrum, younger and younger, as young as 12 years old, being referred to intervention services or other kinds of programs intended to help draw them out. And I think that's in part because of the online engagement, especially through the gaming and other chat rooms. So very worrying trend we're seeing there. And again, the online engagement, so very important for them. We're seeing coalition building. Again, the convoy, there were at least 14 identifiable far-right groups that were very active and very visible during the convoys. We see here, this was during the sort of last round, if you will, of irregular migration across the border, where we have multiple groups coming together, Storm Alliance, Lamut, Three Percenters, which is a militia group, sort of came together to act as border patrol because they thought the border authorities weren't doing their jobs. So very intimidating meeting them at the border. And the last trend I'll note here is that we're seeing an increasing reference to guns rights narratives in the Canadian context, which is something new. It's borrowing American language about the right to bear arms, that sort of thing. And so we see groups engaging, images of them engaging paramilitary training out in the woods, with stockpiles of guns, semi-automatic weapons, so that they are armed and ready for that invasion of immigrants or Muslims or whoever they think is the enemy. But they're also trying to get training, advanced training, by recruiting folks with military or law enforcement backgrounds, or themselves enlisting, especially in the reserve reserve elements of Canadian Armed Forces so that they can get the training that they think they need. So they think they can get the training they think they need to to strategize, to engage in tactical training amongst their group members and their peers. So again, I think a dangerous combination of arms, the capacity to use them, and then those xenophobic or anti-other narratives that they carry with them. So I think very dangerous. So what do we do? I know I'm probably way over time, so I'm going to run through this very quickly, but I think the bottom line here, and you can see for yourself, the bottom line here, two pieces. One is to be aware, to increase your knowledge and understanding of these elements of hate that we're seeing, these manifestations of hate that we're seeing, where they're coming from, why they've emerged in the time that they have, and the impacts as well. So I think, enhancing awareness and knowledge and understanding is the first thing, and then being willing to act, to not be a bystander, but to be an upstander, to challenge hate where you see it, to help inform others. What and sharing what you learn in whatever context that you might be learning it, sharing resources with people to help them educate themselves as well. So I think again that awareness and that willingness and capacity to act very important in this space. And then there's the broader challenges and broader, I think, actions that we need to see. Obviously, we need authentic and concerned political leadership, and leadership in the right direction that is willing to call out hate and act on it. I think if I hear one more time, hate has no place in our communities, I'll throw myself out a window. Clearly, it does because it continues to persist. So it's I think maybe not enough to call it out, and then what are you going to do about it? How are you going to act on it? So we need greater leadership there. Certainly not polarizing speech. Certainly not the narratives that are reflected by the hate mongers that we've been describing here. And part of that, I think, that political leadership involves action plans around racism, discrimination, hate. We do now have, since last fall, a national action plan countering hate, which I think is really important to the extent that it will provide enhanced training for law enforcement. It'll provide enhanced supports for victims individually and collectively. But in particular, I think is the funding that's embedded there for funding to support the work of organizations that are already doing the work on the ground. So this is where these multi-sectoral partnerships come in. So government working with civil society organizations, working with schools, perhaps working with universities, working with faith communities, even to develop initiatives intended to counter hate and to help build resilience in the face of hate as well. So we're seeing that at the national level. Some provinces have action plans on racism. Ours has kind of gone by the wayside. But even the municipal level, very important for municipalities, I think. And maybe this is where you have the strongest voice, is at the local level. And how can you encourage your local government to implement the sorts of policies and practices and programs even that will help to stem the tide here. I think part of this is helping police to enforce existing legislation. The Crown's judges as well will provide training not just for law enforcement but for Crown attorneys as well as judges as well. Ongoing conversations about strengthening online hate legislation. There is now an online harms bill before Parliament, which is likely to die on the table in light of a likely election. So I think that will need to be resuscitated after the next federal election. And then, of course, I've talked a lot about the harms of online hate. So I think important here that we develop strategies for countering online hate, and in particular, enhancing critical digital literacy, not just for youth, but for adults as well. Too many of us just, share or like or whatever, posts that come across our screen without really reflecting on them. What is the message there? What did that cartoon, what did that joke really mean? Let's unpack that a little bit more. And I think we could do a better job of that as a way of stemming the dissemination, if you will, of negative messaging. And obviously, the sort of work that I'm doing on a regular basis like this, both the research, but also more importantly, I think the importance of public forums on hate, public conversations on hate and how to counter it. So important for enhancing our collective awareness and understanding of the problem, and consequently our collective capacity to intervene and to challenge hate where we see it, and to develop even the strategies for preventing it from emerging in the first place. So, plenty of work to be done in this space, and I continue to do it. And I hope that what I've shared with you today hasn't demoralized you completely, but in fact will provide some stimulus for you to share what you've learned and to think about what you can do at the individual level to intervene. Perhaps what you can do as a community in your church to intervene against this sort of messaging and action. So I thank you. You see my contact information here and the URL for our website at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. As I say, please do reach out to with any questions you might have. Very happy to engage. And again, can't thank you enough for the invitation, and I wish you well. Thank you.
So some of you ask me, what can we do? There's a lot on those last 2 pages. And I would invite you to think as we are coming with our offering today about the kinds of things that we are able to do as a community, maybe as individuals. Someone from our community of faith was telling me how just a couple of weeks ago, there was a situation on a subway train where one person was really trying to intimidate the other. And they just quietly moved over and they stood facing the person who was being intimidated and blocked the view from the other person and said, "Are you okay?" "I'm okay." But just checked in with that person and made sure that at least for a few seconds, well, actually waited until the other person got off the train, that they knew that there was somebody who was aware that they were being treated badly. Those little things mean a lot, and they are also an example to the other people on the subway train. And this is a really good video, and I would encourage you to say to the people you know who would like to be engaged with this kind of thing to take the time to listen to it, to make it one of their podcasts for the week, and think about what it is that faith communities can do, not just ours, because we are doing stuff, but that others can do as well to be engaged with this and sure, stand between 2 people on the subway train, and also say to the people who may be running for office right now, what are you going to do about the incredible increase in hate crimes in our city, in our province, in our country, over and above all the other things that are happening? So reflect some more, listen some more, and well, I would say to you, don't be afraid to do something, but that would be totally inapplicable to anybody in this church. So engage and indulge your sense of justice and passion for others. Holy One, we acknowledge to you that we have devious minds. We easily tell the truths we believe and shape truth so that we may be comfortable in our beliefs. We do not allow our minds to detail the dissonance we know when we are not who we say we are. We do not allow our minds the questions we need to ask ourselves about the inconsistency of our words and our actions with our claims. We do not allow our minds to admit our biases and prejudices when we feel unsafe in ourselves. We do not allow ourselves to say we are racist or sexist that we are ageist, classist, ableist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic. We are loath to give up the privilege we enjoy because of our race and gender and wealth. We do not burn crosses or demean people. We want them to have their own place in society and stay in it. Holy One, forgive us for our devious minds. We believe in your grace, a grace that makes it safe for us to admit who we are without fear of judgment. We only are judged by ourselves, sometimes too harshly, and sometimes we think not harshly enough. We believe in a grace that helps us tell ourselves the truth, that we fear those who are different, fear those who might take away what we have, fear those who judge us for our inadequacy in treating them as human beings. We do not ask for mercy this day. We ask for courage to see ourselves, to see the effects of our attitudes on others, to, with grace, confront those who diminish others. We would trust ourselves to you so that our confrontation begins in our own minds and hearts. Amen. May the words of our mouths be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Thank you for watching. If you appreciate this content, please share it with your friends. Consider giving us a like, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon, as it really helps our channel. And as always, be good to you.